I never thought the biggest mistake of my life would show up on my doorstep, tucked inside a plain white envelope. The morning air was thick with humidity, and my nightgown clung to my body as I opened the door. My husband Eric was already gone for work. He left before sunrise most days, still chasing that ever-elusive promotion that never seemed to come. I had just stepped onto the porch when I saw him. Our mailman, Mark, younger than me by at least a decade, fresh-faced, with arms that looked like they belonged to a man who actually used his body instead of sitting in an office all day. He grinned as he handed me the mail, and I felt that familiar tingle run down my spine. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, his eyes lingering on the way my thin nightgown barely covered my thighs. "Looks like something important in there." I took the stack of letters, my fingers brushing his just long enough to let the contact linger. "Important, huh? Guess I'll find out." He smirked, his tongue sliding across his lower lip before he turned back to his truck. I stayed on the porch longer than necessary, watching him drive away, my stomach tightening at the memory of the way his hands had felt on me just a few weeks before. Inside, I sorted through the mail, bills, junk, and then an unmarked envelope. No return address. The kind of thing people send when they want to stay anonymous. I should have thrown it away. I should have known nothing good comes from mystery letters. But curiosity has always been my weakness. I slid a nail under the flap, pulling out a single sheet of paper. My breath caught the second my eyes landed on the words. "Your husband is cheating on you." My stomach twisted. My heart pounded so hard it made my ears ring. Eric? No, it wasn't possible. He worked too much, too late. He barely had time to kiss me goodbye in the morning, let alone carry out some affair. I stared at the page, hands trembling, but it wasn't just an accusation. It was detailed, specific. A time, a place, a name. Bethany Parker. I felt the blood rush to my face as recognition hit me like a slap. She was a family friend, someone we had dinner with, someone who had hugged me just last month at a barbecue. The paper slipped from my fingers. My knees wobbled. It had to be a mistake, a cruel prank. But if it wasn't... I thought back to all the nights Eric had come home late, the way he showered the second he walked through the door, saying he'd been at the gym, the business trips that didn't add up, the lack of interest in me when we used to barely make it through dinner before dragging each other to bed. The signs were there. I just hadn't wanted to see them. A slow, steady rage started to rise inside me, a kind of anger I hadn't felt in years. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, taunting me. I could call him, confront him, demand the truth, or I could get even. The thought sent a thrill through my veins. If Eric had been stepping out on me, then maybe it was time for me to do the same, and I already knew exactly who I wanted. My fingers wrapped around my phone, pulling up Mark's number. The last time we'd texted, it had been harmless flirting, playful. But this time, I wasn't in the mood to play. I typed out a message. "Hey, are you free later?" I hit send before I could change my mind. The response came almost instantly. "For you, always." A slow smile spread across my lips. Maybe this letter wasn't just a warning. Maybe it was an invitation. Mark arrived at my house just after sunset, his truck pulling up discreetly at the curb. I had left the porch light off on purpose. No need for the neighbors to get curious. He stepped out, his frame silhouetted in the dim glow of the street lamp, and my pulse kicked up as I opened the door before he even knocked. The second he stepped inside, I felt the heat rolling off him. His eyes swept over me, taking in the low-cut blouse I had deliberately chosen, the way my shorts barely covered my thighs. I had no intention of wasting time. "Nice place," he murmured, but his voice was rough, like he knew neither of us cared about small talk. "You thirsty?" I asked, stepping toward the kitchen, knowing full well my hips swayed with every step. "Not for a drink," he said, his voice husky, and I barely had time to turn around before his hands were on my waist, pulling me against him. His breath was warm against my neck, and the tension that had been coiling inside me since I read that letter snapped like a rubber band. I turned in his arms, pressing my body flush against his, my hands finding their way under his shirt, dragging my nails along his stomach. He let out a low groan, his grip tightening. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just the raw thrill of knowing I was finally taking something for myself. "You're sure about this?" he murmured, his lips hovering inches from mine. I laughed, running my fingers through his hair. I wouldn't have texted if I wasn't. That was all the confirmation he needed. His lips crashed against mine, and everything else, the letter, Eric, Bethany, disappeared into the background. Hours later, I lay beside Mark, my skin still warm from his touch, staring up at the ceiling. My body was satisfied, my mind less so. The letter still burned in the back of my thoughts, a reminder that this wasn't just about pleasure, it was about revenge. "You okay?" Mark's voice was lazy, relaxed, as he traced circles along my thigh. I turned to face him, propping myself up on one elbow. "Yeah, just thinking." His fingers trailed higher, teasing. "About what?" "About how I'm going to find out if that letter was telling the truth." His brow lifted slightly. "You think someone just made it up?" "I don't know," I admitted, running my fingers over his chest absent-mindedly. "But I want proof." Mark smirked, rolling onto his back. "You want me to help?" I glanced at him, surprised. "You do that? You think you're the only one who hates cheaters?" His jaw tightened slightly, something flashing in his eyes. "I've been on the other side of it before. It sucks." Something about that stirred a deeper connection between us, but I shoved it away before it could settle. This wasn't about feelings. This was about getting what I needed. "Then yeah," I said. "Help me." Over the next few days, I played the role of the oblivious wife. I made dinner. I kissed Eric goodbye in the mornings. I even asked how work was going. But behind the scenes, I was watching, listening, gathering every little piece of evidence that might confirm what that letter had claimed. Mark and I devised a plan. Eric had a habit of saying he was working late, but I had a strong suspicion he wasn't spending those extra hours at the office. So, I decided to test him. "Hey, babe," I said one evening as he came through the door, loosening his tie. "I was thinking we should have a date night this Friday. Just us." Eric barely glanced at me as he poured himself a drink. "I have to stay late at the office. Meeting with a client." "Oh, which client?" I asked, feigning interest, my heart hammering in my chest. Henderson Group." I smiled, acting like I wasn't mentally making a note to check if that was true. "That's too bad. I was really looking forward to it." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe next week." Mark was already parked a few blocks away when Eric left the house on Friday evening. I told him to follow, to see exactly where my husband went when he claimed to be at work. My phone vibrated hours later with a message that sent my stomach into a freefall. "He's at a hotel, room 214, and he's not alone." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The confirmation should have broken me. Instead, it ignited something even darker inside me. "You want to confront him?" Mark texted next. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Confronting him would mean giving him the chance to explain, to lie, and I wasn't in the mood for lies. "No," I finally typed back. "I have a better idea." Mark didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. I didn't cry that night. I didn't curl up in bed feeling sorry for myself. I planned. The next morning, I stood in front of my full-length mirror, adjusting the dress that hugged every curve just right. If Eric wanted to cheat, I was going to show him exactly what it felt like. And I knew just the man to help me do it. Mark arrived right on time. I had given him no explanation, no real context, just a simple message. "Come over, wear something nice." He didn't ask questions, and that only made me want him more. When I opened the door, I could see that he had taken my instructions seriously. He was wearing a crisp button-up, sleeves rolled just enough to show off his forearms, dark jeans that fit perfectly. He looked good. Good enough to make me forget, for just a second, why I had asked him here in the first place. "You look incredible," he murmured, his eyes dragging over me like he was memorizing every inch. The dress I had chosen was deep red, dangerously low-cut, hugging me in a way I knew would grab attention. It wasn't an accident. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be wanted. I stepped back, letting him inside, locking the door behind him. "I have a plan," I said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "But I need you to trust me." Mark leaned against the counter, his fingers tapping lightly against the glass as he took it from my hand. "I trust you," he said easily, and I believed him. "Eric's away," I continued, swirling the wine in my glass. "But he'll be back soon. I want him to see something when he gets here." Mark's brow lifted, his interest obvious. "What kind of something?" I took a slow sip of my wine, then placed the glass down with deliberate care. "The kind that reminds him he's not the only one who can play dirty." Understanding flashed in Mark's eyes. He didn't need me to spell it out. He pushed off the counter, closing the space between us in 2 easy strides. "Are you sure?" His voice was low, rough, sending a shiver down my spine. I met his gaze, unwavering. "More than I've ever been." I barely had time to set my glass aside before his hands were on me, gripping my waist, pulling me against him. The thrill of it coursed through me, wiping away every last doubt. Mark wasn't just some revenge tool. He was a choice. My choice. The next few hours were a blur of heat, skin, and whispered promises I had no intention of keeping. It wasn't just about getting back at Eric. It was about reclaiming myself. Mark made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I wasn't ready to let that go. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I was sprawled across my bed, tangled in sheets. Mark propped up beside me, tracing lazy patterns along my bare shoulder. There was a dangerous satisfaction humming beneath my skin, the kind that came from knowing I had taken control of something that had once made me feel powerless. Then, right on cue, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Eric was home. Mark looked down at me, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" I reached for him, running my fingers through his hair before pressing a slow, deliberate kiss against his lips. "I've never been more sure of anything." Downstairs, I heard the front door open. The weight of the moment settled over me like an electric charge, crackling in the air. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't anxious. I was ready. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. Mark shifted beside me, waiting for my cue. Then the bedroom door swung open. Eric froze in the doorway. The look on his face was priceless. Shock, disbelief, anger all warring for dominance. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I took my time sitting up, letting the sheet pool around my waist, making no effort to cover myself. I wanted him to see me like this. "Welcome home," I said, my voice dripping with satisfaction. Mark didn't move, didn't flinch. He just watched Eric, a silent challenge in his expression. He wasn't apologetic, he wasn't ashamed, and that only made it better. Eric's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "What the hell is this?" I tilted my head, pretending to think. "Oh, you mean what it looks like? I'd think that's pretty obvious." His face reddened, veins standing out in his neck. "You're cheating on me?" I laughed, actually laughed. The audacity of the question was almost impressive. "Oh, Eric, don't be ridiculous. I'm just following your example." His confusion faltered for half a second before realization hit him like a brick wall. He knew. He knew I knew. Mark shifted beside me, his presence a deliberate statement. He wasn't going anywhere. I had made my choice. Eric's nostrils flared, his breathing ragged. "You don't understand." I cut him off before he could even try. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand you've been lying to me for months. I understand you thought I'd never find out. And I understand that you're not the only one who gets to have secrets." Silence stretched between us. He wasn't expecting this. He had never expected me to fight back, to take control. He took a step forward, but Mark moved, subtly but purposefully, as if reminding him he wasn't just facing me anymore. Eric swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between us. So what now? I leaned back against the pillows, feeling nothing but satisfaction. That depends on you. His face twisted, torn between anger and uncertainty. He had lost his leverage. For the first time in our marriage, I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let it go. Eric's face twisted, his jaw tight, eyes darting between me and Mark. The weight of my words had settled in, but his anger hadn't faded. It had only sharpened into something unreadable. He had been caught, exposed, but he wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of humiliation. He shifted slightly, his fingers clenching at his sides like he was trying to decide what to do next. Mark didn't move. He sat there beside me, calm, composed, and completely unfazed by the tension crackling through the air. His presence wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge, one that Eric clearly wasn't prepared for. Eric finally took a step forward, his voice low, clipped. So, what's the plan here? You just, what? Throw this in my face and expect me to, what? Walk away? His eyes flickered toward the Mark before settling back on me. You don't think this makes you just as bad as me? I laughed softly, stretching out on the bed, making a show of how relaxed I was, compared to the rigid fury running through him. Oh, Eric, I think you and I both know there's a big difference between what I've done and what you've been doing. I picked at the edge of the sheet, letting the moment hang between us before I continued. I don't lie about what I want. I don't sneak around in hotels, whispering empty promises to someone else while coming home to play the role of a devoted husband. I tilted my head, my eyes locking onto his. No, Eric, I don't think we're the same at all. His nostrils flared, and I could see the vein in his temple twitch. He hated this. Hated that I had taken control of something he had thought he would always be in charge of. He had expected tears, screaming. He had expected me to crumble under the weight of betrayal. He hadn't expected me to fight back. Mark finally spoke, his voice casual, as if he were discussing something as mundane as the weather. You didn't really think she'd never find out, did you? Eric turned his glare onto him, his hands clenching into fists. This doesn't concern you. Mark smirked, utterly unaffected. I think it does, seeing as I'm part of the equation now. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Eric took a slow breath, exhaling sharply before shaking his head. You think this changes anything? He scoffed, his tone bitter. You think this makes you powerful? All this does is prove that you're just as selfish, just as weak. I studied him, taking in the way he tried to deflect, to turn this back on me. It was almost sad how predictable he was. I let out a small, knowing smile. You're deflecting, Eric, because if you actually had to face what you've done, you'd have to admit that you destroyed this marriage long before tonight. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He knew I was right. I stood up, moving slowly, deliberately, until I was just inches from him. You don't get to be the victim here, I murmured. Not after everything you've done. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't say anything. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out what his next move should be. Finally, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping just slightly. So, what happens now? His voice was quieter, not quite as sharp. I smiled, stepping back, my eyes never leaving his. That depends on you. Eric hesitated for a long moment, then nodded once before turning on his heel and walking out the door. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair before turning back to Mark. Well, I said lightly, that went better than expected. Mark chuckled, standing up and stretching. He's pissed. Good. I grabbed my glass of wine from the nightstand and took a slow sip. He deserves to be. Mark studied me for a moment before stepping closer, his fingers trailing along my arm. You okay? I met his gaze, searching for any sign of pity, of judgment, but there was none, just quiet understanding. I let out a soft sigh, placing my glass down. I will be. Mark nodded, his touch lingering for a moment longer before he pulled away. So what's next? I thought about that for a second, the weight of everything pressing against me. My marriage was in ruins, my husband was gone. And yet, I felt freer than I had in years. I smiled. I think it's time I start living for myself. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. But just as I started to enjoy that freedom, my phone buzzed. I reached for it, expecting a message from Eric. Maybe an angry rant, maybe an attempt to apologize. Instead, it was something much worse. I know what you did, the text read, and I'm not the only one. My stomach dropped, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my pulse pounded in my ears. Mark leaned over, frowning as he read the message over my shoulder. Who is it? I didn't recognize the number. No name, no hint of who could have sent it. I don't know, I whispered. Mark's expression darkened. Think it's Eric? I shook my head. If it was, he'd just say it. This is something else. Another message popped up before I could even process the first one. Meet me tomorrow. Same place he took her. Come alone. My hands trembled as I read it, dread curling in my stomach like a vice. I had wanted to take control. I had wanted revenge. But now, Filas, it felt like someone else was holding the strings. Mark's hand rested on my shoulder, grounding me. You don't have to go. But I knew I did, because whoever this was, they knew more than they should. And if I ignored them, there was no telling what they might do next. The drive to the hotel felt longer than it should have. My grip tightened around the steering wheel as I replayed the text messages in my head, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever sent them knew too much, and that alone terrified me. The idea of Eric setting this up seemed unlikely. He would have confronted me directly, let his rage spill over in person. This was something else, someone else. And I had no idea what I was walking into. Mark had offered to come with me, but I refused. The message was clear: come alone. Bringing him would only escalate whatever this was. So I drove alone, my thoughts racing as I pulled into the parking lot of the hotel where Eric had met Bethany. The place looked different in the daylight, less shadowed, less illicit, but it still reeked of secrecy. I parked near the back, my hands trembling as I killed the engine. I didn't want to be seen. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my purse and stepped out, scanning the lot for anyone who seemed to be watching. Nothing. No sign of who I was supposed to meet. Just rows of parked cars and the distant hum of traffic. The text had given no room number, no additional instructions, just this location. My phone buzzed again. Room 214. I hesitated before making my way inside, my pulse hammering as I climbed the stairs. I reached the door, my breath hitching. My fingers hovered over the handle before I knocked. A moment passed, then another. The door creaked open, and I found myself staring at a woman. Bethany. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, eyes cold. The very woman my husband had betrayed me with was now staring at me like she held all the power in the world. My stomach churned. I figured you'd come, she said, stepping aside to let me in. I wasn't sure you'd be brave enough, though. I entered slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. What is this? You're the one who sent the messages? She shut the door behind me, locking it with an eerie sense of finality. Of course I did. Who else would? Anger bubbled beneath my skin. So what? You get caught screwing my husband and now you want to play games? Bethany smirked, pacing to the window. I didn't bring you here to play games. I brought you here because you needed to know the truth. I folded my arms. What truth? That you're a liar, a homewrecker? That Eric is a cheating bastard? I think I've got the basics. Bethany turned, her expression unreadable. Eric and I were never what you think we were. I scoffed. I saw the proof, the receipts, the messages, the hotel reservations. And yet you don't know everything. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Eric didn't choose me. Not really. I was paid to keep him busy. My breath caught in my throat. Paid? By who? She hesitated, and for the first time I saw something crack in her mask of confidence. Your husband's boss. I blinked, thrown entirely off course. Why would his boss pay you to sleep with him? Bethany exhaled, rubbing her temples. Because Eric was becoming a problem at work. Too ambitious, too reckless. They needed leverage over him, something to control him with. So they sent me in, made sure he got tangled up in something he couldn't get out of. I stumbled back a step. That's insane. That doesn't even make sense. Bethany gave a humorless laugh. You think powerful men don't play dirty? You think they wouldn't do whatever it takes to keep someone like Eric in check. The affair was never real. It was a trap. And he walked right into it. My mind reeled. Then why tell me now? Why send those messages? Bethany hesitated. Because Eric is in danger. Real danger. And I think you are too. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? She gestured to the bed where a folder sat open. I was supposed to keep him in line, but he started digging, asking the wrong questions. Now they're coming after him, and if they know you're involved, they'll come after you too. I sat down heavily, my head spinning. Who are they? Bethany swallowed hard. People who don't like loose ends. And right now, you and I are both loose ends. A knock on the door made both of us freeze. Bethany's face drained of color. It's too soon, she whispered. They shouldn't be here yet. She moved quickly, grabbing my wrist. We need to leave, now. Panic surged through me. Leave and go where? Another knock, harder this time. Followed by the sound of a key sliding into the lock. Bethany yanked me toward the window. Anywhere but here. The door swung open, and everything happened at once. A man in a suit stepped in, his face unreadable. He was calm, too calm. Going somewhere? Bethany shoved me toward the window. Run! Now! I didn't hesitate. I scrambled onto the ledge, gripping the frame with shaking hands before lowering myself onto the fire escape. Bethany followed, her breath ragged. Behind us, I heard the man curse under his breath. Get them! I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. The metal stairs rattled beneath our weight as we scrambled downward, our breath ragged, our hearts pounding. We hit the alley, feet slamming against the pavement, and I barely had time to think before Bethany grabbed my hand and yanked me forward. Come on! We ran until my lungs burned, until the sound of footsteps behind us faded, until we reached my car, parked out of sight. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Bethany yanked the passenger door open and we both tumbled inside. Drive, she gasped. Now! I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. I turned the key and floored it, my tires screeching as we tore out of the parking lot, leaving the hotel, and whoever had been after us, far behind. Silence filled the car, heavy and suffocating. I could still hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. I could still feel the rush of adrenaline surging through my veins. Bethany exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her forehead. That was close. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. What the hell have I gotten myself into? Bethany looked at me, her eyes dark. Something bigger than both of us. And if we don't figure out our next move, we won't get another chance. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. This had started as a betrayal, a revenge story. Now it was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. I wasn't just fighting for control anymore. I was fighting to survive.